problem. Report. You're listening to Uptown Radio. It's Friday, March 8th. I'm Bianca Giacobone.
And I'm Alex Coletta. Staffers at senior centers in New York City say low budgets are forcing them to turn away the elderly when they're in need.
Food insecurity is it's really hard. I just feel really bad sometimes denying them. It breaks me.
A new proposal would give you power to a civilian board to curb police abuses.
That is why we are here tonight, for New Yorkers who are afraid of the police.
A group of New York City nurses is prepared to strike. They're worried about nurse-to-patient ratios and don't think hospitals are taking them seriously enough.
If they had to pay a bill for their water, they would pay it. But when it comes to paying a bill for safe staffing for their patients through nurses...
Finally, Governor Andrew Cuomo announced an initiative to turn internet security jargon into plain English. But does he have the right focus? All that and more on Uptown Radio. But first, the news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Lakshmi Singh. The U.S. economy is coming off a month during which job growth nearly stalled. Only 20,000 jobs created in February, but the jobless rate ticked down to 3.8% and wages rose. President Trump's been touring tornado damage in Lee County, Alabama today. NPR's Debbie Elliott has the latest.
The president and First Lady visited a disaster relief center and got a helicopter tour of the scope of the devastation. They met with survivors in the hard-hit Beauregard community, including a family who lost 10 people in the tornado. Trump said of the damage, "I've never seen anything like it," and promised that FEMA will stay in Alabama as long as needed. The powerful tornado cut a path nearly a mile wide through Alabama and Georgia on Sunday, one of more than 36 twisters confirmed in the southeast during a severe weather outbreak. Forecasters say tornadoes are possible again this weekend as hazardous storms move through the region. Debbie Elliott, NPR News.
There's been another top-level resignation at the White House. NPR's Mara Liasson reports the president's communications director, Bill Shine, stepped down today.
The White House issued a statement saying Shine had offered his resignation and the president had accepted it. Shine says he's looking forward to spending more time with his family. The White House says Shine will serve as a, quote, senior advisor to the Trump re-election campaign. However, that role has not been defined. Shine was the president's fifth communications director in just 2 years, an inherently difficult job working for a president who acts as his own communications director but expects his communications staff to generate the kind of positive press coverage he feels he deserves but doesn't get. Shine was a top executive at Fox News for more than 20 years before coming to the White House, where he stayed in the job for just 9 months. Mara Liasson, NPR News, the White House.
Within a deepening political and economic emergency, Venezuela is now struggling to recover from its worst blackout in decades. Power reportedly is back in on parts of the capital, Caracas, but vast portions of the country are still without electricity, causing disruptions across a broad range of public services. President Nicolás Maduro's administration blames the outage on a problem it characterizes as sabotage at the country's main hydroelectric plant. Elliot Abrams, the U.S. Special Representative for Venezuela, says the U.S. had nothing to do with it.
The nationwide power outage throughout Venezuela is a reminder that the country's once quite sophisticated infrastructure has been plundered and allowed to decay under Maduro's misrule.
With Venezuela's economy in tatters and many people barely able to afford the most basic supplies, President Maduro is under threat of being overthrown. More countries, including the U.S., recognize opposition leader Juan Guaido as Venezuela's legitimate president. From Washington, this is NPR News.
And this is WNYC.
From Columbia Radio News in New York, I'm Camille Peterson. Former Nassau County Executive Ed Mangano was convicted today in federal court of bribery, fraud, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Mangano held office from 2007 to 2017. Mayor Bill de Blasio said the Department of Probation will fire a former New York City police officer who was arrested yesterday on federal charges for assaulting a man at the Bellevue Men's Homeless Shelter in Manhattan. Cordell Fitz was a police sergeant at the Department of Homeless Services until he resigned last year after the incident. If convicted, Fitz could face up to 30 years in prison. Newly elected public advocate Jumaane Williams joined several city council members to oppose part of Governor Cuomo's MTA funding plan. The plan would use tax revenue from legalized marijuana sales to help fund the MTA. Williams said the taxes should instead go to communities most affected by marijuana criminalization.
It's a terrible plan, and it's based in the type of ignorance we've seen happen over and over in this community.
Governor Cuomo's office estimates the marijuana taxes could contribute $2 billion to the MTA. A group of 14 children's and education advocacy groups is opposing cuts to a program that connects homeless students with social workers. Mayor de Blasio's yearly budget eliminates nearly $14 million from the program. Last year, a record number of students was homeless. This morning, Massachusetts Senator and 2020 presidential candidate Elizabeth Warren announced a plan to break up large tech companies like Google, Facebook, and Amazon. Tonight, Warren will make a campaign stop in Long Island City, Queens. The neighborhood was briefly Amazon's choice for its second headquarters. It's 37 degrees and partly sunny in Central Park. There are delays on 2, 3, A, and L trains. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Camille Peterson.
This is Uptown Radio. I'm Alex Coletta.
And I'm Bianca Giacobone. At a public hearing at City Hall last night, advocates, city officials, and NYPD debated a proposal for a new civilian board on police misconduct. The elected review board would investigate complaints against New York police officers, especially in cases of excessive force. Hannah Critchfield has more.
Saul Albanese is Charter Revision Commissioner. He's helping the City Council figure out whether or not to put an amendment to the Civilian Complaint Review Board in November. When he took the temperature of the room, the audience's response was clear.
My question is to anyone on the panel, are these things not working?
Many members of the audience burst out laughing. Many in the packed room are holding signs of loved ones lost to police violence and are ready to speak about their fears of law enforcement, like Pamela Monroe, chairwoman of the New York campaign for an elected civilian review board, a coalition of 41 organizations.
One day, while canvassing in Brooklyn, we met a young black mother who told us she has arranged her work schedule morning and afternoon to walk her kids to and from school. This wasn't to protect them from gangs or criminals. She said this was to protect them from the NYPD. That is why we are here tonight, for New Yorkers who are afraid of the police.
Advocates of an elected board say it would put power back in the hands of the people and want it to have the force of law. The current Civilian Review Board can only make recommendations for disciplinary action, but critics say that's ineffective. In 2017, just under 4,500 complaints were filed against city police officers. But to date, no officers have been fired as a result of the board's recommendations. Rob Davis is with the National Police Foundation. He says an elected civilian review board with that kind of power would create enforcement problems within the police.
I mean, that really poses a difficult situation for a police chief or commissioner, because if it takes discipline out of the hands of the police chief, then that really, I think, weakens the authority of the chief.
And he says there's another problem. There's no blueprint for how to make it work. The elected board would be the first of its kind.
It would be highly unusual. But again, as far as I know, it hasn't been tried, so it would be a novel experiment that you're doing.
Joseph Jockalone teaches criminal justice at John Jay College. He's open to the idea, but not without some checks and balances. Jockalone wants candidates for the review board to undergo a review themselves.
Careful examination of people's social media histories. Some of the things I see, especially with people with blue, check marks next to the name, the anti-cop bias is pretty strong. Like, for instance, they would never elect somebody like me to be on the Civilian Complaint Review Board because of my, pro-cop stance.
Jockalone says that's because he's a retired NYPD detective sergeant.
So we shouldn't have people who are too pro-cop and we shouldn't have people who are too anti-cop.
Back at City Hall, Brian Corr, president of the National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement, says the idea of an oversight board elected by civilians is becoming more common. But he's on the fence. He's worried about unintended consequences, like elections influenced by money.
There will be lots and lots of effort to make those elections turn out the way that those forces want. If you have an elected review board, it is by its very nature political.
The Charter Revision Commission will review comments heard at the meeting and decide whether to put an elected civilian review board on the ballot in November 2019. Hannah Critchfield, Columbia Radio News.
A database made public this week compiles over 2,000 lawsuits and complaints against New York City police officers. The aim is to hold officers accountable for misconduct, but critics are worried about false allegations sullying the data. Jamie Calvin, a journalist with The Intercept, created a similar database in Chicago a few years ago with the Invisible Institute, an organization he founded to help hold institutions accountable to the public. Hey, Jamie, thanks for taking the call.
My pleasure. Glad we could connect.
So what is the Citizens Police Data Project, and how did it come to be?
So it's the product of close to a decade of litigation, first in federal court and then in state court. It culminated in a ruling that in Illinois, documents bearing on allegations of police misconduct are public information. It was a long legal struggle to get there, but really knocked down the wall of official secrecy. So the Citizens Police Data Project grew out of that effort and is a wholly public database that we put a lot of work into. Now it contains about 250,000 individual allegations against police officers. And I should be clear about the nature of the data. These are mostly citizen complaints and some internal administrative investigations, but the preponderance are citizen complaints, most of them coming from low-income African-American communities, and the vast majority of which are weren't seriously investigated, weren't sustained.
So in New York, police are able to withhold certain records to protect officers. How does the law differ in Chicago?
Yeah, so that's what we broke through. In Chicago, prior to the Calvin decision, it was pretty parallel to New York. And we faced very similar resistance from both the city and the police union that, as I understand it, is the case in New York. And one of the ways in which the Chicago experience is really relevant to the debates about this in New York is we now, are several years out in having a wholly public database with ever more information in it. And none of the, horrible outcomes that were predicted, particularly by the police union, that officers would be targeted, that their families would be harassed, that police operations would be compromised. None of those things have happened. Mm-hmm. The very fact of this information being public is a kind of game changer. And it means that the ongoing debates and the necessary debates about police reform increasingly take place with reference to a common evidentiary basis, a common body of evidence.
What impact has this database had in Chicago?
It's changed institutional practice. It has provided a kind of a biopsy of the system itself. And, increasingly we're able to do really sophisticated sort of pattern analysis. So, the impact has been pretty pervasive, and it's just, sort of changed the conversation. The good news is if this kind of information is used effectively, and if there's the political and institutional will to do it, there are really significant improvements that are possible.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Jamie. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
My pleasure as well. Thanks.
That was Jamie Calvin, an investigative reporter with The Intercept and founder of the Invisible Institute.
Senior centers are a lifeline for many elderly men and women in New York City, a place where they can socialize and get a hot meal. But the center resources are limited, and they often have to turn people away. City officials are hoping to solve this problem. Reporter Cynthia Betubiza has more.
It's a windy, gray, snow-slushy day in the Bronx. Inside the East Concourse Neighborhood Senior Center, people are sipping coffee and tea, chatting, and playing pool. Laurent Lewis is a 72-year-old retired nurse from Puerto Rico who's been coming to the Senior Center for the past 8 years. Like many at the center, she comes from more than just socializing.
Like in the morning, you might grab a cup of coffee, but we have lunch. Then we have in the afternoon, they will serve some kind of a snack.
Today, she's one of the lucky ones. Like most days, there are more people wanting a meal than the center has the capacity to serve.
We're only contracted to serve about 60 to about 80 people daily. So when we reach that amount, that's it. we gotta say no to people, which is unfortunate for an 80-year-old that has nothing and no one.
That's Christina Rivera, the program specialist at the center. She manages the food budget at East Concourse. She says turning the elderly away puts them especially at risk.
Food insecurity is very, it's really hard. I just feel really bad sometimes denying them services, and it breaks me. It does.
Joel Berg is the CEO of Hunger Free America. He says that more than 10% of older New Yorkers suffer from food insecurity. Sometimes they have to pick between their next meal and paying the bills.
There are significant pockets of poverty among older Americans, and at least for some older Americans who have reduced mobility, it's harder for them to physically access the food.
That's why he's concerned about funding levels for meal programs at centers like East Concourse. He's not the only one. Last week, the City Council held hearings on senior center food budgets. Margaret Chin is the chair of the New York City Council Committee on Aging. In the hearing, she noted that the city's funding for food programs hadn't been raised since fiscal year 2015.
The cost of living. I mean, food price goes up. I think that's where the urgency is. I mean, the centers are hurting. I mean, they need the relief as quickly as possible.
Tara Klein is a policy analyst at the group United Neighborhood Houses. Speaking at the hearing, she said senior centers are going into debt because they want to feed as many people as they can.
Organizations will often incur deficits to meet the needs of their communities and ensure seniors receive meals. One UNH member has said that they are contracted to provide 65 daily lunches at their center, but regularly provide over 90 due to increased attendance.
At the end of the hearing, Karen Resnick, acting commissioner for the Department for the Aging, said her department will continue to look into the issues.
As we discussed, we're happy to have that conversation with you offline, and we'll do a little more analysis about those programs.
Chairwoman Chin then closed out the hearing.
We just want to be loud and clear this year that we're not going to take anything less.
In the meantime, the Department for the Aging will continue working on their draft budget. After that, they'll present it to City Council for another review. Cynthia Betubiza, Columbia Radio News.
When you think about New York City zoning regulations, you don't usually think about fun. But one nonprofit group is trying to change that, one block at a time, or one mega block at a time. Stephanie Horton tells us about a workshop to demystify the complex subject of zoning.
On an icy Saturday morning in Soho, 7 strangers, all of them active in their communities, sit around a table making buildings out of mega blocks. Imagine bigger, brighter Legos.
Does anyone want to talk about their building and what it's used for?
Mark Torrey places an L-shaped stack of blue and red blocks on the edge of the game board near an area marked Deep Water.
I built one of those crane gantries that they have for the ships down into Red Hook,
Karina Lee of Grow NYC stacks her blocks wide to make an open space work environment.
I am envisioning kind of like a commercial building.
These people come from different neighborhoods, but each one is affected by zoning. In fact, everyone in New York is affected by it. Zoning regulates what you build, where you build, and even the shape of your building. If you want to make a change in your neighborhood, or even complain about a change in your neighborhood, you have to understand the basics of zoning. You could turn to the city's 1,300-page zoning resolutions manual, or to the Center for Urban Pedagogy. The center is a nonprofit which specializes in taking complex subjects and making them simple. Mark Torrey teaches the workshop and explains.
The idea is really to sort of take you from a place where you don't know anything about zoning to a place where you are pretty knowledgeable about zoning by the end of it. So this thing's going to really start at the beginning and then work its way up, and by the end you're going to know a lot of crap about zoning.
They do learn a lot of crap about zoning, and they do it in a fun way. These participants spend hours sticking together megablocks making tiny cities. Red for commercial, blue for manufacturing, and yellow for residential. Claire Beltran teaches the workshop with Torrey. She slams down a giant chunk of blocks in the middle of the beige city grid and calls it an asphalt plant.
If you were a city planner, where would you put this plant?
On the outskirts.
That's basically what zoning is. Zoning is just like putting similar things or uses together.
Halfway through the hour-long workshop, these community mavens start getting into the nitty-gritty concepts like floor area ratio. While it certainly sounds like the least sexy concept, it's actually deeply meaningful. It determines how much floor space you are allowed to build on a lot, which then determines how tall your building can be. The calculations can be tricky. Tori says the workshop exists for concepts like these.
The need came from our community partners who, expressed their desire to have a fun, visual way to talk about these complex things like floor area ratio.
These workshops aren't just for playing architect. They are meant to be lessons to take back to community boards so everyone can understand how things can change in their neighborhoods. Jorge Cavanillas is from Queens. He used what he learned from these kinds of workshops to fight a developer in his neighborhood who was trying to build a 13-story luxury condo.
So it's going to be this massive tower that we saw as a direct threat to the neighborhood, just in terms of accelerating gentrification.
Cavanillas learned from these kinds of workshops how many steps there are to rezoning. Once he knew that, he and his grassroots group, Queens Neighborhoods United, could intervene every step of the way.
We applied enough pressure to the council member and to the developer that the developer eventually pulled out their application.
As the cleaning staff cleared out the space, Cavanillas bought the textbook that comes with the workshop for $15. He said he's going to use it to teach his community about zoning. The only thing he needs now are some building blocks. Stephanie Horton, Columbia Radio News.
This is Uptown Radio. I'm Alex Coletta.
And I'm Bianca Giacobone. After a fatal crash in upstate New York that killed 20 people last October, Governor Cuomo wanted to ban stretch limousines. After opposition from the limo industry, he reversed his decision. Now, he is proposing that all limo and large vehicles, old and new, install seatbelts for their passengers. Reporter Andrea Salcedo talked to limo companies about how this could impact their business.
Under federal law, new fleets of vehicles, including limos, cabs, buses, school buses, and liveries, are required to have seatbelts. But many old fleets of mass transportation cars in New York don't have seatbelts at all, especially modified vehicles like stretch limos. Under Governor Cuomo's new budget, that would change. But not all limo business owners are happy about it.
Many of these companies will have these vehicles that don't have seatbelts out of their fleet, within the next 4 or 5 years, regardless. So, and many of us have already gone in that way because of the federal requirements as well.
That's Kevin Barwu, president of Limousine Bus and Taxi Operators of Upstate New York. He says it would cost as much as $30,000 to install seatbelts in old vehicles. But Ross Rader, with the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety in Virginia, says safety has no price.
When you're thinking about people's lives, the cost of adding belts to an existing limousine is really a small investment.
Plus, Rader says, safety in limos is not usually a passenger's main concern.
There is this attitude that when people are in limousines and they're out celebrating, that somehow they don't need to follow the safety habits that they would if they were riding in the back seat of a passenger vehicle. The laws of physics are not repealed because you're celebrating an event in the back seat of a limousine.
Some business managers like Kenny Cruz, manager of New App Limo, have gotten on board with Cuomo's proposal. I went to his offices on the Upper West Side to get his take.
Hello, yeah? Who is this? Hello?
If we're in the business of transporting people, we have to make sure we do it correctly. And we have to make sure that, at least on our end, for whatever we have to be responsible for, we have to also be liable for. So unfortunately, if it'll help us improve our safety, then by all means, yeah.
Cruz says that he understands why many business owners would oppose this measure, but that in the car service industry, safety should be the provider's main concern.
And if safety is not a concern of yours for your passengers, then you shouldn't be in business at all.
Andrea Salcedo, Columbia Radio News.
Here in New York, it's hard to see stars in the sky, especially stars that are really, really far away, way off in distant galaxies. Someday we may not be able to see them at all. That's according to new research from the University of Michigan. Maggie Green explains.
You have a huge cloud out in space.
It's 7 p.m. in Greenwich, Connecticut. Constellations speckle the sky from horizon to horizon. It's freezing and almost pitch black inside the Bowman Observatory. A woman with long blonde hair peers through the giant telescope at the Seven Sisters star cluster.
It almost looks like
tiny pinholes with lights in them.
Beyond that lens, the universe opens up. Galaxies, nebula, and star clusters focus into view.
Oh, wow.
Ever since the Big Bang, almost 14 billion years ago, the universe has been expanding. That means that every galaxy is pulling away from every other galaxy. Astronomers don't really know why the universe is pulling apart or why it pulls apart faster when you move further from Earth, but they're trying to figure it out. A new study accepted in Physical Review Letters demonstrates a piece of this mathematical puzzle. Dragan Huderer is one of the authors on this study.
Imagine you're an ant living on a balloon. And the balloon is your world, the surface of the balloon. And that world, somebody's blowing up the balloon. So the balloon is expanding.
As the balloon expands, the distance between you and any other point on the balloon will increase at the same rate. And eventually, as each point in the universe pulls further and further away from every other point, we'll start to see fewer and fewer galaxies. Then one day, the Milky Way will be totally alone in the universe.
For those of us who have a chance to be around 100 billion years from now, the sky will be empty.
The sky would be empty. For clarification, astronomers say we'll still be able to see stars because the ones we can see are very close to us, but we wouldn't be able to see anything outside of our galaxy, like the Cigar Galaxy, 12 million light years away. It's actually shaped like a cigar, and it's moving away from us at about 200 kilometers every second. So why do cosmologists, the people that study the furthest reaches of the universe, care about what's happening billions of light years away?
Yeah, that's a question I get sometimes. Why do you do cosmology? Why do you study? It doesn't have any immediate implications. We study to learn more about the place we live in, which is the universe.
It's our innate curiosity that drives cosmologists to ask these big questions. Where do we come from and where are we going? And the more we learn about this puzzle, the more complicated it becomes. But that just makes room for the next group of astrophysicists to start asking those same questions and start finding answers.
We discovered something really remarkable about the universe.
At Columbia University, a few dozen people gathered on a Friday evening to learn about the way light travels through the universe. Cosmologists can use bright objects, like supernova, to determine how fast the universe is expanding.
But it's a spectrum of what?
It is a spectrum of all the elements.
Connor Golsong sat on the edge of his seat throughout the lecture, and then raced to the podium to ask questions at the end. He's 12 years old, red hair and freckles, and he already knows he wants to be an astrophysicist. He says space exploration is inevitable.
It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. Humans have a drive to explore, to discover, to find new things. It's in our nature. Ever since those first apes on the plain learned to walk upright and use spears.
And if anyone is recruiting explorers to travel to distant galaxies.
Sign me up, Captain.
It's easy to see where Golsong gets his enthusiasm when you see the Cigar Galaxy as a sliver of light in the Bowman Observatory's telescope. Every bit of light is millions, maybe even billions of years old. When we look at the stars, we're really looking back in time. Cosmologists like Huderer are trying to look forward and predict how this night sky in Connecticut will look a few billion years from now. Golsong says whatever happens, he's sure it'll be
something unimaginable, something amazing.
And he hopes he'll be the one to figure it out. Maggie Green, Columbia Radio News.
You're listening to Sounds of the City on Uptown Radio.
Just before you came in, there was a woman who was asking about a book about a cat with shoes, which I figured out by Google searching the words cat with shoes kids book.
This is Eli Maskin, children's bookseller on the Upper West Side.
I think maybe people walk into a bookstore expecting to have this smell that smells like knowledge and learning, but no, it's a room, that's usually filled with 3 to 5 year olds and their parents and their diapers. So don't inhale too deeply in here, I would say. I try not to.
You're listening to Columbia Radio News. Online, Fridays at 4 p.m.
Let's see, what else do we want to sell?
You're listening to Uptown Radio.
There's more to come. Stay with us.
This is Uptown Radio. I'm Alex Coletta.
And I'm Bianca Giacobone.
Coming up, some state lawmakers are drafting a bill that, if passed, would make New York the first state where it is legal to both buy and sell sex.
And a visit to two art fairs that set themselves apart from the blue chip Armory show.
These stories and more coming up. First, these headlines.
From Columbia Radio News in New York, I'm Lauren Lantry. President Trump is in Alabama this afternoon visiting victims of a tornado that killed 23 people last week in Lee County. Funeral services began yesterday. Chelsea Manning was ordered to jail by a judge this morning after refusing to testify to a grand jury. Manning is best known for disclosing hundreds of thousands of classified military documents to WikiLeaks. She will remain in jail until she testifies or the grand jury finishes its investigation into WikiLeaks. Today is International Women's Day. This morning, the United States women's national soccer team filed a gender discrimination lawsuit against the U.S. Soccer Federation. Team members have claimed gender discrimination has affected their paychecks, training, medical treatments, and coaching. The team will defend its championship title in the FIFA Women's World Cup this June. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reports cases of measles are surging in the U.S., but outbreaks abroad are far worse. In Madagascar, it was reported today there have been almost 1,000 deaths in the past 6 months, most of whom were children. Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan announced today he will not allow any militant groups to function within the country. This comes at the end of a week where Pakistan has cracked down on Islamic militants, seizing over 180 religious schools, all run by banned groups. By the time markets in Turkey closed this week, the value of the Turkish lira dropped by 1.5%. Turkey's relationship with the United States has been under stress. Turkey has a defense contract with Russia and is still deciding whether to sign a missile contract with Raytheon, a U.S.-based company. But Washington has made it clear. Turkey can either choose Russia or the U.S. It cannot have both. Oil output and exports for the United States climbed to a record high this week, as the U.S. became the largest producer of oil in the world, with more than 508 million gallons of oil produced each day. The Dow is down by just 22 points. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Lauren Lantry.
This is Uptown Radio. I'm Bianca Giacobone.
And I'm Alex Coletta. The New York State Nurses Association is making a big push for safe staffing, mandatory nurse-to-patient ratios in every hospital. In Albany, the nurses group is pushing for new legislation. In New York City, members are negotiating with major hospitals, threatening to go on strike if ratios aren't put in place. But as Camille Peterson finds, not everyone in the world of healthcare agrees the mandatory ratios are a good idea.
Julia Szymborski is 34, and she's an operating room nurse at New York Presbyterian. When she shows up for her 12-hour shift, she picks up scrubs.
They recently changed from a nice pale blue color to kind of an offensive cranberry color.
Then she puts on a hair cover and goggles, and she gets her assignment for the day.
It's always a surprise every morning. What surgeon am I working with? What surgery am I doing?
But sometimes there aren't enough nurses to go around. Szymborski has been a nurse for more than a decade, and she says as a nurse, this is her worst nightmare.
Because you're having to make decisions that no one should be forced to make.
Check on a patient who had surgery or prep blood for a transfusion. She says these choices aren't just hard for nurses, they affect patient care, and they're why nurses need staffing ratios. Hospitals don't publish data on staffing levels, but the New York State Nurses Association says concerns like Szymborski's make up 2/3 of complaints from nurses at New York Presbyterian and Montefiore. The New York City Hospital Alliance, which represents those hospitals and Mount Sinai, says current staffing levels are safe, and mandatory ratios would worsen patient care. Sean Clark researches how to improve hospital care at NYU's College of Nursing. He agrees nurses are put in a tough place when hospitals are understaffed.
They don't want to feel, one, as if they're being forced to cut corners on patient care, and two, they don't want to feel as if they're putting themselves out there. You know, sometimes they say that they're putting their professional reputations and even their licenses on the line.
But Clark says the research on nurse staffing ratios is murky.
In terms of what research says, we just don't know.
Mandatory ratios only exist in California and 2 states in Australia, so Clark says it's hard to draw big conclusions. He says researchers have studied how staffing levels affect patient outcomes, and the risk of bad outcomes is consistently lower in hospitals with more staff. but not by much.
Jumping from there to saying that we can draw some lines in the sand about conditions that should never be permitted, that's a big leap.
Plus, Clark says ratios could have unintended consequences. Say one nurse has a patient who needs a lot of care, so they want to hand off one of their other patients to a different nurse. If nurse number 2 has already hit their ratio, they can't take on another patient. That's why when ratios were on the ballot in Massachusetts last year, some nursing organizations opposed them. They were worried about losing flexibility. Carrie Chan teaches hospital operations at Columbia Business School. She says with fixed ratios,
you don't have the flexibility to reallocate and utilize your resources in the most efficient manner.
Chan says ratios are a good idea, but as guidelines, not rigid rules.
My fear is that it could tie your hands where you're too reliant on each patient needs half of a nurse's time.
Ratios can also be a tough financial sell for hospitals. Ashley Swanson is a health economist at the University of Pennsylvania.
So what hospital leaders are going to argue is that they're already adequately staffed given their resources.
Staffing ratios could mean higher payroll costs without a guaranteed improvement in care. But Julia Szymborski, the OR nurse, says ratios should be a no-brainer for hospitals.
You know, if they have to pay a bill to Con Ed, they would pay it. If they had to pay a bill for their water, they would pay it. But when it comes to paying a bill for, say, staffing for their patients through nurses,
she says hospitals are reluctant. Nurses at New York Presbyterian, Montefiore, and Mount Sinai voted this week to authorize a strike if ratios aren't put in place. Their next meeting with hospital management is less than a week away. Camille Peterson, Columbia Radio News.
It's National Consumer Protection Week, and Governor Cuomo yesterday announced a new initiative to warn consumers of the risks of personal data online. As a first step, the State Division of Consumer Protection released an analysis of Venmo's privacy policy. Doc Searle is the director of Project VRM at Harvard University, which works to empower customers in the marketplace. He joined us this morning to discuss the governor's new initiative. Doc, thank you so much for joining us on Uptown Radio. So let's start with the bigger picture. How are things looking for digital consumers in New York and in the U.S. today?
We're terribly disadvantaged. I took a quick look at the governor's proposal, and I think it's totally inadequate. And it's not that we don't need government help. It's that we do need tech. We need tech that gives us the power to proffer our own terms, to explain what our privacy policies are.
When you say we need tech, what do you mean exactly?
We have technology for privacy in the physical world. It's called clothing and shelter. We've had clothing and shelter for 10,000 years. These send very clear signals to others of what's okay and what's not okay. We do not have clothing and shelter online yet. It's not there yet. We need to build that. That's the technology we need.
Is this process you're talking about a legislative process? Is it something that the government has to do or has to enforce?
We have to be careful about putting the regulatory cart in front of the technology horse. In the physical world, we have ways of signaling our intentions regarding privacy through gestures and handshakes and facial expressions. We do not have that online yet. And until we do, any regulation we have is going to do nothing more than make the standing status quo worse. That's what I see Governor Cuomo's proposal doing. It operates inside a status quo that is horribly broken. The whole notion that you have to sign an agreement with every website you deal with to accept cookies that spy on you is completely broken. We should never be spied on for any reason. There's no excuse for that. We wouldn't allow it in the physical world. We shouldn't allow it in the technology world.
So Cuomo's initiative to break down and make more simple the privacy policy of Venmo. Venmo is the first company they've analyzed, is not going to be very effective in any way.
Making Venmo's policies better is a complete fail. And there are a zillion companies like that. All of them, nearly all of them, have completely unfair and wrong policies. And the whole system simply doesn't work. We don't walk around the physical world signing agreements everywhere we go that are proffered only by other parties. It's completely absurd. But the fact that it's the norm online doesn't make it okay. And trying to get the government involved in that it tends to substantiate a status quo that is as completely broken as one can be.
So do you think we will fix this broken internet system, or do you think our life will change as a result of it?
Oh, I think we'll fix it. I think, problems are made to be fixed. Any one of us can be the first party in our agreement with other parties on the internet. We shouldn't have to start with the assumption that we are always the subordinate party, we always have to agree to others' terms, and that we basically are second-class citizens online. That's not how it was designed in the first place. We can fix that. It's not that hard. It's just a matter of focus and funding.
That was Doc Sears from Linux Journal and Harvard University. He joined us today to talk about Governor Cuomo's new initiative to protect privacy online. A spokesperson for Venmo told Uptown Radio the company takes its users' trust very seriously and welcomes the effort to inform and educate consumers. The governor's office has not responded to a request for comment by the time of this broadcast.
Laws regarding prostitution have long been debated in New York State. Now legislation is about to be proposed that could broadly change the legal landscape of sex work and the lives of sex workers. State senators are working to draft the legislation along with a coalition of over 20 organizations, including current and former sex workers. Sophia Amati reports.
Biani Garcia is a transgender woman and community organizer in Jackson Heights. But when she first transitioned at 18, she faced discrimination. No one would hire her, and she was desperate.
It's just like a work to survive. When you are trans and you can find no job, it's difficult. And that pushes you to do sex work.
Cecilia Gentili is another former sex worker.
Sex workers are your family members, are your friends, are your neighbors, are, we go to the same doctor that you go, we are here and we have rights and, we deserve to be, to have a voice and to decide what's better for us.
Today, Garcia and Gentili are members of a coalition working with state senators to introduce new legislation. One of the bills, introduced in January, would eliminate the criminal statute relating to loitering for the purpose of prostitution. Another bill, now being drafted, would go even further. Senators Ramos and Salazar are putting together the legislation that would decriminalize the sex trade entirely. Jared Trujillo is a public defender at the Legal Aid Society and is also part of the effort. He says that if passed, these bills would completely change how the legal system addresses prostitution by creating a kind of sex workers' bill of rights.
So you're not just decriminalizing sex work, but you're also giving these people recourse if they are abused, if they are physically abused, if they are sexually abused. It's just to get humans dignity that they should have gotten a long time ago that they don't currently have because there's this idea that sex work is not work.
Trujillo says there's another reason to change the existing laws. They are often used to target and discriminate against other communities besides sex workers. Garcia says she has experienced this firsthand.
Here in Jackson Heights, the police profile you as a sex worker, even if you are doing or not, just for the simple reason of being trans or, dressing sexy. The police assume that you're doing sex work.
But the proposed legislation has not been embraced by all. Taina Bianame is the executive director of the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women based in New York City.
If this law would pass, overnight, New York would have a brothel on every street corner. It would basically be a green light for pimps and traffickers to say, business is open, women are for sale, and come on down.
Instead, her organization supports a different legal model that was first adopted in Sweden in the late 90s, which criminalizes the clients, but not the sex workers themselves. But Trujillo says that only by decriminalizing sex work altogether can you address the inherent stigma and discrimination faced by sex workers.
If it is still illegal for someone to purchase sex workers are not empowered. Sex workers are not going to go to police officers if they're ever abused. You're still pushing the trade underground.
The proposal to eliminate loitering for the purpose of prostitution is currently in the Assembly Codes Committee, alongside another bill that would remove trafficking survivors' past convictions of prostitution from the record. The more comprehensive bill on decriminalizing sex work altogether is still being written, and legislators say they hope to finish drafting the bill this spring. For Columbia Radio News, I'm Safira Ahmadi.
There is an Uptown One.
You're listening to Sounds of the City on Uptown Radio.
Please stand away from the platform.
They're from the 1950s or 60s, and they're kind of cascading. And then at the bottom, there's some bells. So as you walk, you hear that noise. It would probably drive people crazy. I mean, some people anyway. But.
Ron Caldwell ringing a pair of earrings at his vintage store in Chelsea, Manhattan.
There's pieces that are not for everybody. There's this very dramatic necklace on a mannequin behind me here. It's from the 1940s, and it's Austrian crystal, but it's very large. Something like Marilyn Monroe would have worn back in the 50s. Just when you think you've seen it all or you've seen the most amazing thing, something else comes along to replace that, so you're always kind of looking for that next thing, which is kind of fun.
You're listening to Columbia Radio News, online Fridays at 4 p.m.
This is Uptown Radio. I'm Bianca Giacobone.
And I'm Alex Coletta.
The Armory Show is back in town. The annual international exhibition of contemporary art will host over 200 galleries this week, making it one of the largest shows in the country. But over the last decade, a pair of art fairs have grown up alongside the Armory Show, each offering a different alternative. Maddie Foley has more.
Amanda Uribe's booth at the Independent Art Fair is dominated by a CVS receipt. You know the ones, but bigger. Much bigger.
And the receipt sort of highlights these intimate things that people buy that we don't necessarily share with people. She has Goya chickpeas and Goya black beans, and she has plantains.
Uribe is the owner of a nomadic art space called Latchkey. Her booth is one of 64 packed into a renovated warehouse on the Lower East Side. It's her first time showing here at the Independent.
I think, Independent looks at, what is happening in the art world and gives platforms to people or galleries that are not necessarily like your typical exhibition, artist roster. They really take chances.
Since 2010, the Independent Art Fair has opened alongside the famed Armory Show. Throughout those years, the Independent's goal has remained the same. Showcase smaller, up-and-coming galleries that haven't yet caught the eye of New York's high-end collectors. Across town, in Tribeca, there's another fair, with a different sense of what it means to be independent. Clio is a fair for artists who don't have gallery representation or choose to represent themselves.
It means that it's not your common gallery settings. Art lovers are going to come to these kind of fairs and feel more intimate talking to the artists.
Eduardo Terranova is an artist and an architect. It's his first time showing at Clio in yet another renovated warehouse. He's representing himself. His two paintings hang on a back wall of the fair underneath a skylight. One of them looks like a big, glamorous sun stretched across the canvas.
My art, it's glittery, so it needs sort of light, but at the same time, it's artworks that sort of diffuses light.
At Clio, the goal is a dialogue, a direct conversation between artist and appreciator. Clio employee Elena Minot says that's the reason why, season after season, Clio comes back to New York during the Armory Show.
It's coming here to show their works and find connections and contacts. So and deal directly with the art collector without going through a gallery.
Yeah. But not every artist showing at Clio is self-represented. Berrien Cadet, who paints monochrome oil portraits in big graphic strokes, has worked with several galleries in Europe. What she comes to Clio for is some autonomy.
I can remain independent from the moment that I don't work with only one gallery. I don't have the feeling that I work for someone. If I still work for me in any way, I can work with anybody else to sell my work and promote it.
The Armory Show, the Independent Art Fair, and the Clio Fair are all running through the weekend. By Monday, they'll be all packed up and gone. Maddie Foley, Uptown Radio.
That wraps up this edition of Uptown Radio. We hope you enjoyed the show.
Our executive producer today was Moira Warburton. Leading our staff of reporters were senior producer Ali Swenson along with Maggie Green.
Director Stephanie Horton coordinated our studio production with Cynthia Betubiza and Sophia Amati.
Our web team member Shannon Lin got the stream live to the web. Camille Peterson and Lauren Lantry produced the news. Senior editor Rebecca Ward and assistant editor Sachi McClendon led our copy team.
Our instructors Joanne Farian, Sally Herships, and Ben Shapiro advised our staff. I'm Alex Coletta.
And I'm Bianca Giacobone. Uptown Radio is live on Fridays at 4. Until next time, you can always find us on uptownradio.org. From all of us here at Uptown Radio, thanks for listening.